Hey, I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Mission Matters. My name is Adam Torres, and if you'd like to apply to be a guest on the show, just head on over to missionmatters.com and click on Be Our Guest to apply. All right, so I have Ty Montague on the line, and he's Chairman and Chief Purpose Officer over at Co-Collective. Ty, welcome to the show.
Adam, great to be here. Thank you for having me on.
Oh man, awesome to have you on, and don't think I'm going to let you off the line before we talk about your podcast too. I should add podcast host to your introduction of Calling Bullshit Podcast. So we're going to get into that and more things. But before we get into the podcast, before we get into Co-Collective and what you're doing as Chief Purpose Officer, we'll start this episode the way that we start them all, with our Mission Matters Minute. So, Ty, we at Mission Matters, we amplify stories for entrepreneurs, executives, and experts. That's our mission. Ty, what mission matters to you?
Adam, I'm on a mission to reinvent capitalism, and I realize that probably to your listeners will sound, maybe egotistical, and I don't mean for it to be. I want to put my shoulder. Many people are putting their shoulders to the wheel of really redirecting the entire economic system that we work under, not because it's bad, but because there are some negative things happening with it. So we've currently we are part of a form of capitalism that I would call shareholder capitalism, where really the sole focus of a corporation is to enrich shareholders. And this was because this was a theory that was put forward by an economist named Milton Friedman in about 1970. He was very influential, and he convinced all the business schools to teach students that was the sole purpose of a corporation, was to enrich shareholders. It's now obvious that form of capitalism is leading to lots of negative externalities, pollution, income inequality, climate change, all kinds of bad things. And that's because we need to switch to stakeholder capitalism, a form of capitalism in which CEOs are empowered to take into consideration all of their stakeholders, their employees, their partners, their customers, the communities that they do business in, and the planet, and that all the stakeholders that they serve need to have a say in the in the actions that the company takes in the world. And so if we can create more stakeholder-led companies, we can get capitalism back on track, and that's what I'm trying to do.
Man, that's a big mission and a big task. That's why I love this show, man. It's all about Mission Matters over here, and your mission absolutely matters. And I'm just curious, how did you get on this path? Like, tackling capitalism, that's not like you just wake up one day and you're like, I'm gonna go change everything. Like, how did that happen to you? Or maybe it did. I don't know. I shouldn't say that. Maybe it did. Well, how did that start for you?
Well, it's interesting. I spent a long time in the advertising business, helping businesses tell their stories. And I just noticed over time, and finally this started to bother me, that not all companies, but some companies had a story that they were telling and a different story that they were doing. In other words, that they were not truly living out what they said that they stood for. And I thought, if I could close that gap, the gap between word and deed, right, in the world, just so that companies were doing what it says on the label, so that customers were really clear about what the company was really up to, and that prospective employees really understood what company they were going to work for. If I could just get that gap down to zero between word and deed, the world would be a better place. And so I decided to leave the advertising world and get into launch Co-Collective, which is my company. And that's what we do. We help companies define and align on their true purpose. So we work with leadership teams to really define that and hone it. And then we help them operationalize it internally through organizational and cultural design, and then externally through experience design. And our enemy, we help clients, all of our clients, we help them define an enemy, as well as, because it's great to know what you want to, what you're for, but it's also good to know what you're against. and and we put ourselves through our own process, and our enemy at Co is that gap between word and deed, which we characterize as bullshit, and we're trying to create a bullshit-free world. And it turns out, I'm sorry, this is a long answer to your question, but it turns out that companies that tend to have very low gap between word and deed also tend to be stakeholder-led companies. And so I became aware of and decided to join the conscious capitalism movement. And that's kind of how I got into it. And it's, I certainly didn't start it. I'm not a major leader of it. I'm an enthusiast, and there are many, many, many people jumping on board the train. I assume some of your listeners are on the train, and those of your listeners who are not, I would encourage them to explore it because it's an important thing.
Yeah, it's great. So I gotta say, like, how can, for those that maybe, don't understand or haven't really thought of it, and as you say this, I don't know that I've really. I understand some of the basics, but where do you see? Because you're in this, day in and day out. Like, how can capitalism? Like, how do you see that as really being a force for good? Like, what can you do? Because it gets so much. Like, most of the time when people think of that word, they think, it's just out there to make money, like by any means necessary. But that's not necessarily the case. Like, how can it be good?
Well, that was Milton Friedman's take on it, and as I said, he was very influential, but he has now been largely discounted, right? Milton Friedman, it turns out, was wrong, because if you pursue that form of capitalism, where essentially your job is to maximize profitability for shareholders, you put CEOs in a terrible position, and you put them in a situation of if all they're trying to focus on is growth of profits for shareholders, they start to make terrible choices. They start they start underpaying employees. They start scrimping on things like career development and healthcare and pensions. They bust unions. They underinvest in R&D. They externalize costs by dumping waste in the public commons. And that also enables them to avoid actually charging consumers for the true cost of the products that we buy. Imagine, for instance, what a gallon of gas would cost if you were paying for the cost of climate change every time you filled up your car. Gas would be very much, much, much more expensive, but we create these artificially low pricing because we're not taking into consideration all of the externalities of that product. Conscious capitalism encourages CEOs to pay attention to those externalities, to really think about the impact that they're having on the communities that they serve, on the planet, on their customers, on their employees. And this movement in business has been growing for quite a while. I have a podcast called Calling Bullshit, where we look into this gap between word and deed, and we also do positive episodes where we feature companies that are doing a great job. And my last conversation was with Alan Jope, the CEO at Unilever. Unilever is a giant company, and so if you get Unilever to begin to pursue they make, maybe a lot of people haven't heard of them, but they make, or they sell many brands that you will have heard of them: Dove and Ben and Jerry's and Vaseline and brands like that. If you get a company of that size pointed in the direction of really taking care of the environment, looking after their employees, making sure that they're doing the right thing in terms of managing their waste and managing their carbon footprint, you can make a big impact on the world. And so whether you're an entrepreneur starting a business, I would encourage any entrepreneur to think about starting a purpose-led business. And I would also encourage anybody listening who is running an organization that is already up and going to consider making the transition to becoming a purpose-led business, And the thing is being purpose-led is a process. You're not going to be perfect when you start, and no one will expect you to. The idea is get better incrementally over time as you start to get used to it and understand exactly how all of it works.
What are the what are some of the types of businesses that are a good candidate? And when I say types, I don't mean it has to be like industry, or maybe it's categorized by industry. I don't know. That usually get the most value out of working with you and your team over at Co-Collective. Like, who's a good fit to kind of making this transition?
It's a really interesting question. We tend not to we tend to be very cross category. So we've worked for many companies that you will have heard of. Under Armour has been a long-term client. Google we work with often. We do many projects with IBM. We do projects with not-for-profits as well. We've worked with the ACLU. We've worked with the Museum of Modern Art. We're working with the Kansas City Museum now. So we work with an incredibly wide variety of companies and categories. It's not so much about category as it is about intention, right? Do you want to build the kind of business that attracts better talent? Right? I assume the answer to that, if you're on the leadership team, is yes. Well, if you want to attract better talent, start a purpose-led business or become a purpose-led business, because young people today really, really care about where they work and also where they spend their money. And, right now we're suffering through a trust crisis, especially with young people. Young people are losing faith in our system. Just a couple of stats real quick. Trust in government over the past 20 years has dropped 34%. Trust in media down 15%. Trust in religion even down 24%. In terms of people who agree with the term, journalists are purposely misleading us, or politicians are purposely misleading us, or business executives are purposely misleading us, 67%, 66%, and 63% respectively. The phrase, I'm more fearful than hopeful about our country's future, 59% of young people agree with that. And 50% of Gen Zennials, young people essentially today, have no longer believe in the system of capitalism. And that concerns me. The reason for this is they look around themselves at the state of the country. They look around at the state of the environment, the wildfires, all of the crazy weather, all of the food shortages that are beginning to come from the droughts that we've been experiencing. And they're looking into the future and they're saying capitalism does not have my best interest at heart. But so in a way, another way to think about the mission that I'm on is to save capitalism, because I really do believe that lots of good things have flowed from capitalism. We've created more innovation, more upward mobility, more better health outcomes. They're just the list of things that capitalism has made better is very long. And if we can get rid of some of the negative externalities and get young people back on the train, I think capitalism will be fine. If we continue down the path that we're on, I do fear for it, though, because if you can't win the hearts and minds of young consumers and young employees, you are not a sustainable business. You don't have a long-term future.
I want to jump around a bit here. You did mention
Sure.
the podcast, but I want to go a little bit further. So, Calling Bullshit.
Sure.
What was the inspiration for the show?
Well, two things. One is young people today, as I've just been talking about, are calling bullshit on capitalism itself. They don't believe that. They don't trust that what they are being told by companies is trustworthy or believable. So companies, corporate America has a trust problem with the next generation of consumers. So they are calling BS on corporate America and on capitalism. And simultaneously, as I was talking about before, my company, we have our purpose is to help the bold truly do, and our enemy is bullshit, the gap between word and deed in corporate America. We're trying to close that gap. So we wanted to start a podcast that would be inspiring to young consumers and informative to young consumers, also to potential employees of companies. 2, we wanted to do a podcast that appealed to investors who were looking for, so-called ESG investments or impact investments. And we wanted to do a podcast that would be helpful to leadership teams who want to begin the journey of transformation to becoming purpose-led. So we called it Calling Bullshit. I know it's a provocative name, but we try to, in every episode, even the ones where we do call bullshit, it's the first half of the episode is about the company in question and kind of unpacking the facts of the case, usually with an expert interview. The second half of an investigative episode, we actually try to solve the problems. In other words, our thesis is bullshit is a treatable condition. You just have to take action. And so we define the actions that we think the company would need to take to get back on track. And then we also do positive episodes where we just feature the CEO of an organization that is truly purpose-led and ask them for any tips that they have for how to, their experience of leading a purpose-led organization, in some cases global organizations, and what other, entrepreneurs or business people could take away from that.
That's great. Well, Ty, I just have to say it has been great having you on the show today. I've really enjoyed learning more about Co-Collective and, of course, your podcast. I know we barely scratched the surface on what you're doing over at Co-Collective, and I definitely want individuals to follow up and to connect to learn more. So that being said, what's the best way for them to do that? How do people connect?
Well, they can reach out to me directly on LinkedIn. They can email us. I am Ty Montague at cocollective.com. And if they want to check out the podcast, it's on Apple Podcasts, on iHeart, pretty much anywhere you listen to podcasts, look for Calling Bullshit. And you can also check out the podcast website, which is the callingbullshitpodcast.com.
Fantastic, and we'll put all that information into the show notes so that our audience can just click on the links and head right on over. And speaking of the audience, if this is your first time listening to a Mission Matters episode or connecting with the platform, we're all about bringing on business owners, entrepreneurs, and executives and having them share their story, the mission behind their story, why they do what they do, and what we can all learn from that so that we can all grow together. If that's the type of content that sounds interesting or fun or exciting to you, hit that subscribe button because we have many more mission-based individuals coming up on the line, and we don't want you to miss a thing. And Ty, really, it has been a pleasure. Thanks again for coming on the show.
Adam, thanks for having me. It was great to be here.